the spontaneous brain, from the mind-body to the world-brain problem. This is a book which comes out at MIT Press in September 2018, and I want to present the main thesis and ideas of the books in 3 different talks. I already presented 2 talks, and now the first talk is about the 3rd part of the book. And the main idea of the book is that we need to replace or dissolve the mind-body problem by the world-brain problem. And this sounds very counterintuitive because you ultimately assume that there must be a mind, because if we don't have a mind, we cannot have consciousness or other mental features like sense of self. And therefore, I already showed a lot of empirical evidence and ontological support for the idea of the world-brain problem replacing the mind-body problem. However, you know, as always in daily life, and you all know this only too well, there are certain intuitions, convictions, to which we like to stick. And we are not ready to give up these convictions. Some people call it dogmata. I don't want to go that far. There are certain intuitions which are very difficult to give up. One such intuition was, for instance, in the medieval ages, that the world, the earth, is the center of the universe, and everything revolves around it. Nicolaus Copernicus changed all that. He changed all that and said, no, the earth is not the center of the universe. It is the sun. And earth revolves around it. So now, I claim that we need exactly the same kind of Copernican revolution in neuroscience and philosophy of mind. How? We need to detach us from the idea that the brain is the center of the universe, of the world. Instead, we need to put the brain into the larger context of the world. So instead of the brain, we need to consider the world-brain relation and the brain as integrated and aligned in the wider context of the world. That's why I speak of a world-brain relation. The brain nests within the world, rather than of a brain-world relation where the brain basically nests, the world nests within the brain. But that's paradoxical. Remember, the large Russian doll cannot nest or contain the large one. So, and that's why I say we need a Copernican revolution in neuroscience and philosophy. That's the focus in this 3rd part of the talk. Let me go very quickly through the first 2 parts of the talk, just for those who didn't have the time listening to the first 2 talks. So, the first claim was, the first talk was about world, brain, and consciousness, a lot of empirical evidence. Basically, I discussed the model of the brain. I said we need a spatial-temporal model of the brain, a spectrum model, a brain which is neither fully active or fully passive. It's a spectrum, and that spectrum makes it possible for the brain to align and integrate itself within the world. And that temporal spatial alignment, as I say, is central and predisposes consciousness. That was basically the main message of the first talk. And I said that temporal spatial alignment and world-brain relation predispose consciousness. They are, philosophically speaking, a necessary condition of possible consciousness. So, that established the need for a spatial, for world-brain relation on empirical grounds. And I say, if we have the spatial-temporal relation and space and time understood here as construction of inner time and space rather than as outer time and space as from the outside. And then we don't really need a concept of mind anymore. But that was only on empirical grounds. So, then the second part ventured right into the ontological issues. And you may remember that I sharply distinguished ontology from metaphysics. Ontology is about existence and reality in the actual natural world we live in. Metaphysics is about being in all logical conceivable worlds. Yes, our actual natural world is one possible world within the logically conceivable worlds of metaphysics. That's why ontology is often considered as a subset of metaphysics. However, I don't go down that road. I say that ontology, I just focus on the actual natural world and what makes an actual natural world distinct from other possible worlds. So I only focus on ontological issues. The world-brain problem is an ontological problem, but not a metaphysical problem. I leave that open, the question whether the world-brain problem is a metaphysical problem, open for the expert on the philosophy side to discuss. And then you may remember that in the second talk, I basically said we can establish necessary connections between the contingency problem, that we said we introduce the concept of mind in order to establish necessary connection of consciousness to its underlying ontological or metaphysical substrate. So there's a necessary connection between mind and mental features. However, that in turn raises the question, how can the mind be related and connected to the body, which by default is contingent? That's what I call the contingency problem. That was a core feature of the second part of my talk. And then I said, okay, we can establish, using structural realism as ontological framework rather than property-based ontology, we can establish necessary a posteriori, in the sense of Kripke, connection between world and brain. That is what I mean by world-brain relation, and that is intrinsically temporal-spatial, inner time and space. And that in turn entails necessary connection between brain and consciousness. So here we solved the contingency problem by showing that there's a necessary a posteriori spatial temporally based connection between world and brain relation. So again, assumption number one, make it more formal, assumption number one, there's necessary a posteriori connection between world and brain in terms of world-brain relation. Second assumption, the world-brain relation, its necessary a posteriori connection is a necessary condition of consciousness and brain. Conclusion from the two assumptions, brain and consciousness are necessarily a posteriori connected with each other. That solves the contingency problem, and we no longer need to assume a mind to solve the contingency problem. Instead, we can then speak of a world-brain problem that addresses the question, how must the world be related to the brain in order to make consciousness possible? The introduction of mind is no longer necessary. It can be dissolved and can be replaced by world-brain relation. However, as I said at the beginning of this talk, the intuition of mind is lingering stubbornly. We have certain convictions, subjective certainty, we don't like to give that up, because our subjective certainty is so strong, and we have the feeling it's a high price to pay. If we give up the concept of mind, we are afraid that we lose our mental features, no consciousness is possible, are we just automaton and robot? I say no. Why? Because first we need to conceptually distinguish between the concept of mind on the one hand and mental features on the other. Yes, we introduce the concept of mind to provide necessary connection between mental features and its metaphysical substrate / the mind. However, that does not imply that if we resolve the concept of mind, that we also lose mental features. I make that distinction very clear in the introduction of my book. So I maintain mental features, but dissolve the concept of mind. Now, however, the intuition of mind is strong. So if I really want to establish the world-brain problem, dissolving the mind-body problem, I need to tackle the intuition of mind. And I need to show where does the intuition of mind coming from. Brief historical rewind. When you look into the history of science, we always dealt with intuitions and removal of intuitions. One such intuition was that the Earth was the center of the universe. Another intuition was that there's a life energy. None of these intuitions turned to be scientifically viable. So we dissolved them. We just said, okay, no longer necessary. Now I say, the same with the concept of mind. It's an intuition which is not scientifically viable, and there's no ontological reality and existence to it. The letter I showed, now I need to show, removes the intuition itself. For that, I need to address our methodological or epistemological strategy, how we approach world and brain. That's the main focus of my third talk. How can we avoid the intuition of mind? And how can we take the view of the world-brain problem, which makes the mind-body problem superfluous? The main claim, we need nothing less than the Copernican Revolution in neuroscience and philosophy. Copernicus said the universe doesn't revolve around Earth, around us. I say the world doesn't revolve around our brain, meaning the brain is not the center of the world. And that's an assumption which is usually presupposed in our methodological strategy. And I will show you. Another Copernican revolution. Kant Copernican revolution. However, Kant's Copernican revolution is problematic. And it's problematic for various reasons, and I will not go into that. It's half-hearted. I don't even discuss this in this book because it's too complex. But I'm working on another book where I explicitly point out the problems of Copernican revolution in Kant. There were other Copernican revolutions in other fields. By Darwin, he put us as human species into the wider context of animal species and evolution. So suddenly we were no longer the center of biology, but we are just one sidearm of evolution. In the wider context, remember that. The same Freud. Sigmund Freud put consciousness in the wider context of unconsciousness. And that revealed novel features of consciousness. People speak of humiliations, that we are no longer the center. I wouldn't speak of humiliation. I would speak of revelation. That we see ourselves as part of context of the world, and that gives us a completely new understanding. So for me, it's not a humiliation, it's a revelation. And I say the same kind of revelation or Copernican revolution we need in neuroscience and philosophy. We need to put the concept of brain and its mental features into the wider context of the world. Otherwise, we will not understand mental features and will always revert to the intuition of mind. Once we put that into the context, we no longer need the intuition of mind. In the same way that after Copernicus, we didn't need the intuition of the Earth as center of the universe. After Darwin, we didn't need the intuition of a God which created us as special species. We didn't need it. Same with the concept of mind. I claim that if we conceive the world-brain relationship in the right, proper methodological right, we don't no longer need the concept of mind to explain mental features. Same thing. Nothing less than the Copernican revolution. There is no mind, nor is the brain the center of ourselves in the world. So, I say, the lower part of my slides, how can we take into view the role of the brain for mental features like consciousness? We can view the brain as center of ourselves and the world. That's something we are currently trending to do. But this is very pre-Copernican. We are basically like in a Ptolemaic view of the world. The Earth is center, the brain is center. What is the difference? Same thing. That's the way many of these discussions look like to me. It's a very pre-Copernican view. However, we can also say, okay, the brain is a part of the wider world and its ongoing construction of time and space. World-brain relation. That establishes and requires to conceive that a post-Copernican view. And that makes redundant, if not nonsensical, the intuition of mind. Let me show now how we can develop such a post-Copernican view. I will develop my argument in two ways. First, rejection of the intuition of mind. We require a certain methodological approach with a specific vantage point. I will explain the notion of vantage point. To abandon the intuition of mind as center and subsequently the mind-body problem. Second, after rejecting the intuition of mind, we also need a methodological strategy in order to be able to conceive the world-brain problem as such. For that I said we need a vantage point from beyond the brain which allows to decenter ourselves. The same way Copernicus decentered us. Darwin decentered us. Now I say we need a vantage point which makes it possible to decenter our brain from the center of the world. So decenter ourselves. And conceive the brain in the wider context of the world. That makes possible to conceive the world-brain problem and how it can replace the mind-body problem. Let me start with the first argument. First, what is a vantage point? I give you an example. A vantage point is a viewpoint from which you see something. I now have the vantage point of the camera. But I don't really look beyond the camera because I'm stuck in front of the camera. You there in the audience, you have a much larger vantage point than me. Because you see me as part of the whole setting, including the camera and the audience and everything. But I can't see that. Now, compare that to the Vatican in Rome. You know the Vatican Square, St. Peter's Square, beautiful square. Beautiful architecture, like all Italian architecture. You see, I'm originally German, but I'm already outing myself as a fan of Italy, culture and people and food. And the same also goes for the more eastern side, for China and Japan. However, let's come back. The Vatican Square in Rome, you know, this is where the Pope lives. And beautiful square. Here you see, you're standing on the Vatican Square. You're standing there and you see the St. Peter's Church and you see the whole Vatican thing. This is a vantage point from within the Vatican Square. Yeah? So this is basically like a vantage point. You're sitting here in the audience and you have a vantage point from within the auditorium. Now, imagine there's a viewpoint up there where there's a deck here in the auditorium. And you can step on the deck and you can basically get a bird's eye perspective on the auditorium and me speaking here. So that person up there has a much wider perspective, a much wider viewpoint. That's what I call a vantage point from beyond auditorium. Now here, this is a viewpoint from beyond the Vatican Square. This is from the hills behind the Vatican, and you see much more. And I say that kind of vantage point we need for the brain. So you will see I will speak from a vantage point from within brain, which is pre-Copernican, and a vantage point from beyond brain, which is post-Copernican. I will show you now how it goes. First, what do I mean by vantage point? A vantage point, it's always a balance, a trade-off between transparency and opaqueness. You sitting in the audience here have a vantage point from within audience. You can see the auditorium in much more fine-grained detail. The person up there on the deck who just gets a glimpse of the auditorium does not see the details but has a much larger scope. So the details are more transparent for you. The overall structure of the auditorium is much more transparent for the person up there. And, of course, goes reverse with the opaqueness. And that's important. We need to distinguish such vantage point, beyond or within, from a vantage point from nowhere. That would be a God's vantage point. She or he can see everything. There wouldn't be a discussion between transparency and opaqueness. Because for God, eyes view, everything is transparent by division, by definition. Otherwise it wouldn't be God. There can be nothing opaque for God. So meaning the distinction, the conceptual distinction between transparency and opaqueness wouldn't even occur to God. Doesn't exist. Important. The concept of vantage point is a methodological or operational concept. At best, it's an epistemological concept. It's not an ontological concept. Very important. Yeah? And it is how we approach the kind of methodological strategy / the kind of viewpoint or vantage point we use. As such, it has to be distinguished from other epistemic modes, like first, second, or third person perspective. And nor is it a particular ontology and metaphysics. And ultimately, the vantage point describes how we can conceive and approach the world. We either take a pre-Copernican vantage point or post-Copernican, from within world, or from within Earth, or from beyond Earth, or from beyond Britain. That's exactly what I will show you here. Let me take the example of Copernicus. The pre-Copernican view was a geocentric view that presupposed a vantage point from within Earth, and the universe and the sun had to revolve around Earth. So that's the center is the Earth, and everything revolves around it. That was a pre-Copernican. And I now want to establish 3 criteria which will surface again and again in my talk. What counts as a pre-Copernican vantage point? I will give you 3 criteria. First criterion, there's a spatio-temporal mereological confusion. Spatio-temporal means something larger / the universe seems to be nested or boxed within something smaller / the Earth. That's a confusion. Something larger cannot be boxed in within something smaller. You all know this. Remember? Spatio-temporal nestedness from first and second talk. Same here. Mereology is about part and whole, and again, the part, which is spatio-temporally smaller, cannot be boxed within the whole, which is spatio-temporally larger. But that's exactly what a pre-Copernican view does. It boxes the part, the Earth, the world, which is the whole, and spatio-temporally larger within a part which is spatio-temporally smaller, the Earth. That's why I speak of spatio-temporal mereological confusion. Second, in this case, there is identity between ontic center and ontic location. The Earth is the ontic center, and it's also our ontic location. Ontic means here existent in reality, ontological. So the center of the universe was the Earth in the pre-Copernican view, and the ontic location and the ontic center of the universe is also our locations as humans. So you had an identity between ontic center and ontic location. That's why it's an anthropocentric view. But it's not only ourselves as center. We are center of the whole universe. Second, And third point, which is even more important, that all our knowledge about the universe is referenced to Earth. So you had the Earth did not only serve as ontic center and ontic location, as ontic center of the universe, as ontic location of ourselves in the universe, but also as epistemic reference for our knowledge. So everything had to be referred against our own limited spatial-temporal range in order to be true. And that, of course, doesn't work, because there's something out there in the world which is spatial-temporally much larger. So that's the epistemic reference. So you see now these three criteria will come again. So again and again, that marks the pre-Copernican view. You have the spatial-temporal confusion. Something larger is boxed within something smaller. Slash the universe is boxed within the Earth. The Earth is our ontic location, yes, but it also serves as ontic center of the whole universe. As a psychiatrist, I speak of narcissism. And then the Earth also serves as reference for all our knowledge about the universe, meaning our epistemic reference is taken to be identical with our ontic location. So all our knowledge about the universe is inferred and based upon ourselves as sole and only standard for knowledge about the world. Now, how about the post-Copernican view, a heliocentric view? Now you can speak of a vantage point from beyond Earth, which replaces the vantage point from within Earth. Now the world, now the universe, the sun is the center, and the world, our Earth, revolves around it. I indicated the revolving by the black arrows. I indicated the vantage point here by these red arrows. And you will see this again. Yeah? So now the Earth is part of the wider universe. So it is a decentric, no longer anthropocentric view. So here we basically, in order to see that, we take a vantage point from beyond Earth. Remember in the previous, this one was here. Now it's here. That's the difference between a vantage point from within Earth and a vantage point from beyond Earth. So, now our three criteria. Now, the larger universe spatial-temporally boxes and contains the smaller Earth. There's no spatial-temporal confusion and no merological confusion because the part is within the whole and not the other way around. Now, our ontic location remains in the Earth, but our ontic location no longer serves as ontic center of the universe. That's why it's a decentric view. And now our ontic location also no longer serves as epistemic reference. Because now we can use the universe and the sun as epistemic reference for our knowledge about the world. Remember before, in the pre-Copernican view, we used the Earth, our own ontic location, as reference for our knowledge about the universe. So of course, all our knowledge about the universe was confounded by ourselves. Now we can use the universe as reference for our knowledge about the universe, rather than ourselves and the Earth. So you have a distinction between epistemic reference and ontic location. So now you can see I established three clear-cut criteria for distinguishing a pre-Copernican and post-Copernican view. Spatial-temporal confusion, absence, ontic location versus ontic center, epistemic reference versus ontic location. You see, this is what I develop in the chapter 13 to 12 to 14 in the book. Now I go through different criteria for different kinds of vantage points, which are relevant in the mind-body discussion. So, again, as I claim, we need a Copernican revolution in neuroscience and philosophy. That means that we need to shift our vantage point, our pre-Copernican vantage point, from within brain or mind to a post-Copernican vantage point from beyond brain. That I will demonstrate you now. First, a vantage point from within mind. Mind, the concept of mind is a metaphysical concept which is situated in all logically conceivable world and hence falls outside our actual natural world. That's why I indicated the mind here. I probably should have put a larger mind here, all conceivable world. And from within mind, basically we conceive the world from a vantage point within mind. Remember, we stand on the Vatican Square and conceive everything from there. Same here. We take the mind and conceive and approach everything from there. That obviously gives us a mentor-centric view with us and our mind as center of the world, and here also the logical world. And then obviously the mind as center around which everything, including the natural world, revolves. Does that remind you of something? I hope so. The pre-Copernican view of the Earth as center. Very much so. And I show you why. First, there's a spatial-temporal mereological confusion. The mind, as aspatial and atemporal, cannot be nested within the spatial-temporal world because it's aspatial. And that, of course, predisposes the mind-body problem. We have the spatial-temporal confusion. Our ontic location is also taken as ontic location, as ontic center, and epistemic reference as ontic location. So all the three criteria of a pre-Copernican vantage point apply to the vantage point from within mind. So that marks it clearly as a pre-Copernican model. Now, you might say, oh, we are much better now. We can replace the mind by the brain, and that solves our problem. No. It's exactly the same from a methodological or epistemological approach. Because now you replace the vantage point from within mind by vantage point from within brain. So the mentor-centric view is replaced by a neurocentric view. It is limit to the natural world, yes, so you threw out metaphysics, but you still have the same problem. You still remain pre-Copernican. Let me show you why. Now you take your brain as a center, as a vantage point, so now you stand, basically takes a view of the brain from the brain, like when you stand on the St. Peter's Square in Rome. And everything, the world revolves around it. And that's a spatial-temporal confusion. Because the brain is spatial-temporally larger than the world and basically contains or boxes the world. That is not possible. Every child knows the larger Russian doll cannot go into the smaller Russian doll. But that's exactly what we do in philosophy and neuroscience. We presume that the brain, a smaller doll, spatial-temporally doll, boxes and contains the world as larger doll. That's basically the concept of representation in all of these things. And that again, of course, predisposes mind-body problem and makes necessary connection between brain and mind impossible. Now, so we have a spatial-temporal confusion. And also our brain serves here as ontological location. And then also as center of the world, or connection and cognition of the world. So here, ontic location is identical with ontic center. And our brain then also serves as reference for our knowledge about the world. So epistemic reference is identical with our ontic location. So that's what you call a neurocentric view. And that's what we see a lot in current debate in neuroscience and also in philosophy of mind. So it's ultimately, most often implicitly, a neurocentric view. And that has been a lot criticized from other disciplines like sociology. But the problem is, where we discuss the concept of mind, we still presuppose a very neurocentric or metacentric view of the world, mentocentric view of the world. Now, escape strategies. One escape strategy is God's eye view. So you completely go out and you take a God's eye-like view, and there's, for instance, also in some of the current metaphysics. Another escape strategy is you go for reason. You take a vantage point from within reason. For instance, John McDowell, metaphysics, David Chalmers. That's fine, but it still raises the problem of mind and mind-body problem. Doesn't address it. So a vantage point from within reason or God's eye view doesn't work. Leads you to the same problem. Yet another escape strategy would be the vantage point from within consciousness or a vantage point from within body. From within consciousness is, for instance, mentocentric view, like in panpsychism these days. Panpsychism means that the elements, the basic elements or properties of our world are psychic by default and / mental. And that explains, consciousness and other mental features. That's the panpsychist. Then there's a view that the body is central. That goes back philosophically to Merleau-Ponty, French philosopher in the 20th century. And that is resurfaces a lot in current theses about embodiment and enactment, Alvano, Sean Gallagher, Evan Thompson, and others, which are excellent theories. However, that's still a very centric view. They still presuppose ourselves, as consciousness or body, as the ontic center of the world and as epistemic reference for our knowledge of the world. Therefore, these vantage points are still pre-Copernican. Yeah? And they're still anthropocentric. Because either they presuppose our own mental features, consciousness, or our own body as ontic center of the world. So they are still pre-Copernican views and therefore cannot really address the problem of the existence and reality of mental features and do not really discard the intuition of mind. Because as long as we presume body, consciousness, or whatever of ourselves as center, we still cannot draw a necessary connection to mental features. And that in turn makes necessary to introduce the concept of mind as possible underlying substrate of mental features. Remember? Contingency problem. But we need, and so the intuition of mind remains alive in both of these vantage points, from within consciousness and from within body. We need to have a vantage point which goes beyond ourselves. That's a true post-Copernican vantage point. That will be the task in the next one. We require a vantage point to allow us to view the world beyond ourselves, including its relationship to us. That's what I mean by world-brain relationship. How does such a vantage point from beyond brain look like? It's an allo or egocentric view, a post-Copernican view. Now you see the brain is part of the wider world. You take a vantage point from here, beyond brain, and that establishes a relationship. I also must acknowledge here the concept of vantage point from beyond brain, I emphasize the beyond, stems from Katinka Evers from Uppsala, with whom I initially discussed some of these ideas. And I said a vantage point from within brain versus a vantage point from without brain. But she said the vantage point from without brain goes too deep into other vantage point like a God's eye view. Rather do, how about a vantage point from beyond brain? When I then afterwards rewrote those chapters, and trust me, I rewrote them many times, I really noticed how fruitful that notion was. So, Katinka, thank you very much for that really excellent suggestion, and also for all your other support. So here we have a vantage point from beyond brain. This is no longer egocentric and no longer neurocentric, but it is allocentric and it is ecocentric, neuroecocentric. Now, is such a vantage point post-Copernican? You remember the three criteria. First, now the brain revolves, the world doesn't revolve around the brain, but the brain revolves within the world. Exactly like the Earth revolves within the universe around the Sun. Same thing, the brain revolves dynamically within the world. So now the brain is part of the wider world, which no longer serves as vantage point from which we take into view the world. Now, first criterion, there's no spatial-temporal confusion, because now the brain has a smaller spatial-temporal range, is boxed and contained within the larger spatial-temporal range of the world. The part is part of the whole, rather than the whole being part of the part. So no spatial-temporal confusion, no merological confusion. Obviously, the brain is still our ontic location in its relationship to the world, but it's no longer the ontic center of the world. So there's no identity between ontic location and ontic center. And now our brain no longer serves as epistemic reference. Instead, it is the world, or more precisely, the world-brain relation that can serve as epistemic reference for our knowledge about the world. So this is a very important epistemological implication of this view of a post-Copernican revolution, that is no longer the brain, no longer our mind, no longer ourselves, which serves as epistemic reference, but it is the world-brain relation that serves as epistemic reference. And that has important epistemological implications, which I'm developing now in a book I'm working on. So, basically you have all three criteria, no spatial-temporal confusion, epistemic reference is no longer the ontic location, and ontic location is no longer identical with the ontic center. So that is exactly the same constellation we had in the post-Copernican view of the heliocentric view. So this marks this view, the vantage point from beyond brain, as truly post-Copernican. So, now, what is important here, the vantage point from beyond brain allows us to conceive the necessary connection between world and brain. Remember? The necessary a posteriori character of that connection and how that predisposes consciousness. So, the post-Copernican vantage point from beyond brain allows us to take into view the world-brain problem. And most important, we no longer need the intuition of mind. It simply doesn't occur anymore. Yeah? Because we don't need the mind anymore to account for the necessary connection of consciousness to its underlying ontological origin. Because that is the world-brain relation to which we can necessarily a posteriori connect consciousness and other mental features. So that makes it possible now, such a post-Copernican view, how we can take into view how the mind-body problem can be replaced by the world-brain problem, and that we no longer need the intuition of mind. So this is very analogous to that we no longer need the intuition of God to account for our development and origin of other species and our similarity with other species, Darwinian evolution. We no longer need God as explanatory concept. We no longer need the explanatory concept of a life energy, which was very prevalent at the beginning of the 20th century. We no longer need any kind of mysterious forces, because we know that we no longer need a mysterious concept of mind to account for mental features. We know it is world-brain relation necessarily entails or predisposes, as I like to say, mental features like consciousness. So we have dissolved the intuition of mind, and with it we have also dissolved the mind-body problem, because that question can then no longer be raised. It is superfluous and, if you want to be more radical, nonsensical. Note again for the expert philosophers, this holds only within the context of the actual natural world, within an ontological context. I leave open the metaphysical questions. Why is the Copernican Revolution relevant? A Copernican revolution is needed when you have a pre-Copernican stance, a vantage point from within brain, body, or mind. You have an old theory, mind-body problem, and you have an unexplained phenomenon, the necessary ontological connection between brain and mind. That's the contingency problem. You remember that. Now, the post-Copernican stance, you have a vantage point from beyond, so you shift your methodological approach. You have a new theory, world-brain problem, and you have the phenomenon is now explained that you have a necessary connection between world, brain, and consciousness. Basically, you resolved the contingency problem by shifting your methodological stance. The same way Copernicus and his subsequent colleagues, Galileo, Newton, and others, solved the problem of the relation of the movements of the Earth. So here, Copernicus made possible to take a new approach to the movements of the Earth, to the movements in the universe, which were attributed to the universe and not the Earth in the pre-Copernican view. Now we do the same. I suggest a new approach to mental features, which we haven't explained yet, by shifting our vantage point from within brain or mind to beyond brain. And that makes possible to tackle the problem of mental features in a novel way, in a neuroecological way, and in a spatial-temporal way. And that, I argue, established what philosophers like to call necessary connections between brain and consciousness. The neuroecological and spatial-temporal character of the brain in terms of world-brain relation makes possible to establish necessary connection between brain and consciousness. So that means I open with this shift from a pre-Copernican to a post-Copernican vantage point, I open a new approach, I make possible a new approach both ontologically and empirically to mental features in order to resolve or solve the contingency problem, meaning how consciousness and other mental features are necessarily related to the brain. And we're currently doing a lot of empirical work on showing that spatial-temporal transformation between brain and consciousness, and that is necessary. And ontologically, I sketch you here structural realism as one such approach. So, and that's exactly. I do not claim that I solved the problem of mental features. I'm much like Copernicus, who sketched a new methodological approach to the question of mental features by shifting the vantage point from a pre-Copernican to a post-Copernican. Now, like Copernicus had to wait for his successors, Kepler, Galilei, Newton, etc., to provide empirical evidence in favor of his view that movements are stemming from the Earth itself rather than the universe. Analogously now, I have to wait for empirical evidence to show that mental features like consciousness or sense of self are indeed spatial-temporal features of the brain's spontaneous activity, which ultimately can be traced to the spatial-temporal features of world-brain relation. And we're doing a lot of empirical work on these things these days. And I can only say that you can look it up on my website. The first results are very, very promising. So that provides you a new view of mental features as a spatial-temporal view of consciousness, self, or also psychotic phenomena, what I call spatial-temporal psychopathology. And that ultimately is nothing less than a Copernican revolution. The world does not revolve around our brain, but our brain is part of the wider world and dynamically aligns and integrates with that wider world. So, does the Copernican revolution dissolve the mind-body problem? Does it allow a shift to the world-brain problem? I already indicated. What I try to do in this book is to open the door to a new approach to mental features. I try to to lay the empirical, ontological, and methodological, epistemological basis for a new approach to mental features, which first characterizes mental features empirically as spatial-temporal rather than cognitive features. Second, it characterizes mental features in terms of ontological relation rather than in terms of properties. For that, I use the framework of ontic structural realism, which I extend to spatial-temporal ontic structural realism. And methodologically, I say that we need a new methodological approach to mental features. We need to shift from a pre-Copernican vantage point from within mind, body, consciousness, or brain, to a vantage point from beyond brain, which allows us to take into view the world-brain relation and its as necessary predisposition of mental features. And I hope that many of my colleagues in the different fields, neuroscience, philosophy, epistemology, ontology, might utilize this new framework and expose its weaknesses, but also hopefully its strengths for addressing the problem of mental features. Thank you very much.